Welcome to the P.A.S. Report Weekly Roundup Podcast. The P.A.S. Report provides an honest analysis on the critical issues that matter to you without the biased media filters. Here's your host, Professor Nicholas Giordano.
What's up, everyone? Welcome to the P.A.S. Report Podcast. This is your host, Nick Giordano. Hope everyone had a wonderful Christmas out there. It's the last week. The new year is upon us, and it's been a busy year. So for this episode, what I've done is compiled a bunch of clips from appearances I've done on Dr. Phil, Martha McCallum Show, Tucker Carlson, John Solomon, Eric Metaxas. It's been a busy year here at the PAS Report, and I'm looking forward to 2023. We got a great lineup coming up to start off the month with Victor Davis Hanson. Miranda Devine's going to be joining me. And on Tuesday, December 27th, I will be a panelist on Mornings with Maria, Fox Business Channel, 6 to 9 a.m. So check it out. And I want to thank you for listening to the PAS Report, and I hope everyone has a very happy new year.
Act by partisan forces to crush political dissent, to attack civil liberties in this country. You should care about that. Nicholas Giordano does. He's a political science professor, a host of the PAS Report podcast. He joins us tonight. Professor, thanks so much for coming on. What do you make of this legislation?
Well, it's insane. And when we look at the evidence of the last year since we last spoke, you have the Department of Justice that actually issues a memo targeting parents under the Patriot Act as potential domestic terrorists. You have the Department of Justice creating a specialized domestic terror unit. You have Secretary Mayorkas creating the Disinformation Governance Board. Now, that's been suspended for 75 days. It will be rebranded as something else, I can guarantee that. And then you have President Biden himself labeling nearly half of America as extremist. And it's no coincidence that extremist and extremism appear in the National Strategy for Countering Domestic Terrorism 27 times. Now, what makes it interesting, if you go to the Senate version of the bill, there's actually a provision regarding COVID-19 hate crimes. And it specifically states that racially discriminatory language regarding COVID-19 pandemic, meaning if I say it's from the Wuhan laboratory, then I could potentially be labeled as a domestic terrorist. And this is the problem. When you look at these bills and you have to cross-reference them with previous statutes, we already have over 50 statutes regarding terrorism. We have dozens of statutes regarding hate crimes and organized crime. There are enough laws on the books today to cover this, yet they want to expand the power of and authority of the government, and this is going to be used to target political opposition. It's going to be a pretext. And people should be saying, hey, wait a minute, we were promised under the Patriot Act that you wouldn't monitor and surveil Americans. How well did that work out for us? And so maybe we should slow the brakes on this. And we're the Republican leaders speaking out and pushing back against this, because this was all a year in the making. These are the capabilities being enhanced under the national strategy.
The whole thing is a lie. It's really simple. What percentage of racially motivated crimes and violence in this country are committed by so-called white supremacists? Honest question. Honestly, what percentage? Is it the majority? Don't think it is. So this whole thing is based on
they'll never release that information.
Right.
Are we leading the world? I mean, we're the most developed country in the world. We've got the highest gross national product. We're at the top of the heap in many respects, but are we leading the world in some of those core elements like math and science and reading?
No, we're not even close. So just so everyone's aware, as far as the education system goes, the United States actually ranks 25th amongst all developed nations when it comes to education in reading, math, and science combined. We just declined for the 5th year in a row when it comes to our university institutions on a worldwide ranking scale. It was the 5th year that we declined. And we've created a system where we're just cycling students through the system. And that's become one of our biggest problems, because we see what's happening. I mean, we are the wealthiest nation. We're the sole superpower of the world, at least for now. How long do you think that's going to be going forward if we don't fix this problem? And what really is mind-boggling to me, and I can't seem to get a grasp on it, is why don't we speak about it as much as we should be speaking? This should be one of the top issues within the country, and yet most people remain silent about it.
Well, we've been doing some research on this, and here at Dr. Phil, I have what's called a brain room. We have some researchers that do nothing but research. We do deep dives into the literature when we're looking for specifics. And as of midnight last night, of 79 countries, the U.S. ranked 13th in reading, 18th in science, and 37th in math.
Correct.
That's shockingly bad.
It is. And
that's disturbing.
Well, if you look at every empire that ever exists, they all led in education and innovation at the time. And as we're collapsing, you see countries like China that are rising when it comes to these stats. And we spend more. We spend $1.3 trillion a year on education. That's 7-8 times more than Germany, which is the second country that spends the most money on education. So we're putting all this money in. Where's the return on investment? It's not like we're producing a bunch of little Einsteins out there. And that's part of something that we have to look at. So we have the collapse of the education system, changes in the family unit, and then changes in the mindset of students themselves that have really created problems.
And what kind of changes in student mindsets are you talking about?
Well, I mean, as a professor, why should I have to compete with a smartphone for my students' attention? Why? And this is college level. So it's 10 times worse when you go through the K through 12 level where there's disrespect at the teachers on day in, day out basis. And, you know, can't take away the phones. If you take away the phones, then parents call, they get upset, and fights start breaking out.
You actually feel hostility from your students.
Yeah, there's been a few occasions where students get violent. And honestly, it's not that uncommon anymore, especially in our grade levels. Middle school and up. The fact that they think that they can do it and get away with it is what's scary.
Well, they can.
Yeah. And they
do. If you call the parents, they're not particularly responsive.
It wasn't my kid who did it. That's not my kid. They would never do that. And it's like, well, I just watched it happen. So the denial is real. Or it goes to the other extreme where the parents don't care.
The public education system is supposed to be about social efficiency, civic obligation and responsibility, character, and discipline. We've eliminated all three. And then people wonder why it's all collapsed. It's because we went from where we were, and we've created this system where it's just about, you know, the subject material. And we're not even going to really teach them the subject material. We're going to dumb it down for them. Seniors, 12th graders, are reading at a 7th grade level, just so everyone's aware. And we've deviated far from where the system's supposed to be. And that's part of our problem. Teachers need to be able to discipline the students. They're either not going to discipline them at all, or they're going to give the student like out-of-school suspension where they get to go home and play on their video games. Why not just give them a toothbrush and say, you got to scrub every toilet bowl in this school?
No, but that's corporal punishment.
It's corporal punishment.
That's
You're not allowed to do that.
We're not allowed to do that.
But maybe that would make personal responsibility and students actually think about their actions before they do something again.
So scary but true. A massive cover-up is underway in our education system across this country. American students fall below grade level standards in huge numbers. But do you hear a lot about it, or does it get swept under the rug? That is the warning from Professor Nicholas Giordano.
We've created a system where we're just cycling students through the system, and that's become one of our biggest problems because we see what's happening. I mean, we are the wealthiest nation. We're the sole superpower of the world, at least for now. How long do you think that's going to be going forward if we don't fix this problem? And what really is mind-boggling to me, and I can't seem to get a grasp on it, is why don't we speak about it as much as we should be speaking? This should be one of the top issues within the country, and yet most people remain silent about it.
Yeah, we've just gone through a campaign process where you heard precious little about this problem in the country. Here now, Nicholas Giordano, Campus Reform Higher Education Fellow. He's a current political science professor at Suffolk Community College in New York. Mr. Giordano, thank you for coming in.
Thank you for having me.
I want to start quickly by putting this up. This is what you put on the screen when your students start at the beginning of the semester. Who is the Speaker of the House? Which branch of government has the power to declare war? Who's considered the father of the Constitution? And how many Supreme Court justices are there? How do they do on this exam?
Most will fail it. You know, out of all the students I have, you get about a 10%, 11% pass rate. And then I'll give them the Russian Constitution to see if they could identify that they're not really reading the United States Constitution. And they can't identify that either. They don't see it. So something is broken within the K through 12 system, I noticed, because I've been doing this for the last 12 years, and it really has become a problem that's metastasized. And then I look at the proficiency levels, and they're at absolute historic lows now. But even worse than that, these proficiency levels have been flat for about 30 years. This is the first year we're seeing the decline. At the same time, we've seen standards drop, students reading less, and their grades are going up. So it doesn't really make sense. And all we've done is create a system where we cycle students through so that they get the piece of paper. And this is something that has a critical effect on our nation that we cannot survive. We need a robust public education system. We need it because an education system is designed to give us a sense of civic obligation, to teach us how to be productive members within society and instill some type of human decency. Without it, you don't have a civil society, and that's where we're headed right now. And as the government has expanded into education, as we're pouring more and more money into it, the results are getting worse and worse and worse. But parents have woken up to it.
Yeah, Dr. Jill Biden, the First Lady, is out on the campaign trail today with Randy Weingarten, who we have interviewed many times. We've talked a lot about what happened during COVID and the learning loss that is so dramatic. But what really horrified me when I looked at these new numbers is exactly what you're saying, that where we started in 2019 was already pathetic. It was middle of the road. Like if the score is 0 to 500, we were already at around 235 in these scores. So what is going on here? And what, we only have a few minutes and I want to have you back because I want to dig in on this. What do you think is the solution here? What do we do? This is an emergency. It is an emergency, and it's actually worse than that because the proficiency levels are between 13 to 25% depending on the subject. And the reality is no other industry you would tolerate that. But here we are. And so what we need to see is Say that again. So American students fall between 13 and 25%. Correct. Are proficient American history, in math and reading. Basic proficiency. Basic proficiency. So in American history, it's 13%. In reading, it's about 25%. Math, it's about 23%. Civics, it's about 23%. And that's an Those are all F's, disaster. By the way. Those Correct. Are F's. Correct. And students are still getting through. That's the amazing part. And so we need to completely revamp the system. I mean, we need to stop with the ideologues controlling education. We need to stop with the bureaucracy pushing the curriculums down people's throats, let teachers develop curriculums that want to teach and actually know what education is about. We need to get parents more engaged, and we need to change the mindset of the student body. And those are just obviously superficial. We could go in depth in each one of those. That would take time. But the reality is what we're doing has been working for over 30 years. We continue to do it. And finally, it's getting some attention that the $1.3 trillion that we're investing each and every year isn't producing the results that you would expect. You might as well just throw it down the garbage. Correct. Really. I mean, one of the things that shocks me is what you're saying. We keep pushing. I heard from 2 different universities this year that they were intaking students who had the highest grade point averages that they've ever taken in. And they were really proud of that. The problem is that it's grade inflation. Correct. So during COVID, it was like, oh, you know what, just give him a B, even though he deserves a D. And so now their grades are higher, but they haven't learned the material. No, and in the 1970s, the average GPA was 2.5. Today, it's 3.1. Even though we have the lowest standard. There you go. Dr. Giordano, thank you very much. It's great to have you with us. Nicholas Giordano, we'll continue the conversation. Thank you very much,
Thank you for having me.
Welcome back, everybody. We are delighted to welcome someone who's returning to the show, Nicholas Giordano, professor of political science and host of the P.A.S. Report podcast. Thank you so much for joining us, Nick.
Thank you for having me.
I wanted to ask you something since you are a professor of poli-sci. With respect to the mass shooting in Uvalde, Texas, there's been a lot of conversation about new gun control measures, school security. A lot of people aren't comfortable with that idea. I just wanted to get your general temperature on all of the discussions taking place that take place after every mass shooting.
Well, I'm not surprised. I mean, the immediate knee-jerk reaction is to look at the gun laws because of the emotional aspect to it. I mean, mass shootings are emotional by nature, especially when you have so many children being slaughtered in a single instant. But when we look at mass shootings as a whole, I don't think people are aware that FBI over the course of the last 20 years, on average, there's going to be 53 people that die from a mass shooting. So while it's a significant problem that we have to tackle, when you put the numbers, you have to put it in a little bit of perspective because too many people automatically want to grant government more and more power in order to tackle the problem. And the things that are being proposed aren't really going to solve it in the first place.
Yeah, there's such a disconnect from the rhetoric in Washington and what real Americans think. if someone takes
a disconnect in Washington.
Yeah, I know you're shocked by that. Yeah, I live here. I'm all disconnected now. But you look at someone takes a plane, crashes it into a building, a terrorist attack, we blame the terrorist. If someone takes a car and runs over parade goers in Wisconsin, we blame the perpetrator there, not the car. But when there's a mass shooting, we blame the gun. But here's the weird thing. We just had a poll just come out the other day. Rasmussen reports more Americans believe mental health is to blame for these mass shootings than the guns. How can the rhetoric be so disconnected from what Americans actually see with their own eyes?
Because the politicians are disconnected. I mean, once again, they want to oversimplify the issues, that if we just pass another gun law, that's going to solve the problem. But here's the thing. You have to look at it from a cultural perspective, and that's what's getting lost in the conversation. Something has changed in our culture. Yeah. We had virtually no gun laws. I mean, we had 3 main federal gun laws between the early 1900s up until the 1980s, and we didn't see these types of mass shootings. All of a sudden, starting in the 1990s, we began to see the mass shootings. Columbine became, the symbol of the mass shootings, and they increased each year after that. They started to increase, and the problem has gotten worse. So why, when there was no laws, did the problem not really happen? But yet when we instituted laws, did the problem start to grow? And it's because the problem really lies culturally. We have a disaffected youth that are detached from reality. They're bitter, they're angry, they're resentful, and there's this sense of hopelessness amongst them, and they have no regard for human life. So what changed? If we could tackle that question, maybe we begin to tackle the problem.
Well, Nick, as a professor of poli-sci, I would just like to say I think you have done a fine job, because I look at this youngest generation, especially compared to mine as a millennial, older end of the millennial spectrum. I think that this youngest generation, and polls have shown that they are more pro-life than any other generation. They seem to be more conservative and have a better grasp of the Constitution, because it's not as often that you hear the conversations or the questions regarding gun control posed as, well, you don't need an AR-15 to hunt. And we, as gun owners and Second Amendment supporters, know that they're not for hunting at their most rudimentary basic element. That's not what they're for. Do you think that that's true, that this youngest generation is moving more towards federalism and a truly good grasp of the Constitution and what it stands for?
I think the question's still out there. I don't think that we have an answer to that yet, because if you notice, over the course of the last 20 years or so, the Democrats have done a very good job of federalizing every issue that exists, taking power away from the states. Because, when we look at gun rights and gun control, there are federal and state aspects to it. However, we have politicians going around saying the founding fathers never intended for weapons of war. Well, no, actually, that's the whole point of the Second Amendment, was so that we could arm ourselves in response to a tyrannical government, that it's our job to make sure that government is held accountable and honest. And if government becomes tyrannical and abuses its power, then we have to take responsibility. Now, obviously, times have changed. We accept the idea that we don't have automatic weapons or rocket-propelled grenades. We understand that. But you listen to this administration and you listen to a lot of the Democrats, they're talking about banning every ordinary gun that exists out there, that there'll be maybe pump-action shotguns left. And so I think there is a real disconnect in Washington and what the people want. I mean, don't forget, gun owners are not Republicans. They're Republican, Democrat, Independent, Libertarian. And so it's not like one of those clear-cut party line issues that exist. If you go to a state like Vermont, which is extraordinarily blue, most people in Vermont have a gun. And I think that Democrats are making a big mistake by just focusing on gun laws and trying to take away people's rights, law-abiding citizens' rights.
And you look, Nick, a lot of these shootings are occurring in states where there are very strict gun laws. California had one recently. New York had one, the Buffalo tragic shooting. And even despite all those gun laws, the shooter got a gun lawfully and then committed a crime. So obviously the gun laws aren't going to stop
California's number one in mass shootings over the course of the last couple of years. And that's where people, we're constantly told, follow the data, look at the data.
Yeah.
But yet when it comes to data that goes against their narrative, they just simply reject it. The reality is that the top 10 states, there's 5 blue states, 2 red states, and 3 purple states. That's where we see the most mass shootings. Now, why is that? Obviously, we could look at population size. Obviously, that's going to have an impact and everything.
But when we look at the mass shootings that are taking place, nobody talks about the mass shootings that exist on any given weekend in the major city areas. Yeah. And it's because it doesn't fit that narrative, even though innocent people are dying in those shootings.
Yeah, you're right on the money. Amazing. Nick, when you look out now, what is the best thing that can happen? If there are Democrats, do you see Democrats that are willing to have an honest conversation about this? That it isn't just the guns, that we need to have a holistic solution to this, address those cultural norms. Any Democrats willing to jump into that board? We got about 30 seconds left.
No, I don't think anyone wants to have an honest conversation, because if they did, they would tackle the issue of parenting. They would tackle cultural issues. We'd look at the gun laws. And most importantly, we'd ask the question, maybe this isn't a problem that government can solve. And so if it is a cultural issue, how do we fix that? Which makes it much more difficult to fix.
Great point.
Absolutely. Well, Nick, we appreciate you, and everybody go check out his podcast, the P.A.S. Report. It's an excellent, excellent podcast. And Nick, we will definitely have you back on soon. And like he said, this is a bipartisan issue. You've got blue states and red states alike where people want to retain their Second Amendment. And I think we're moving in the right direction, because we've now got up to 27 states now, over half of the states with constitutional carry. So we've just got to keep fighting and pushing back.
Hey there, folks. As promised, Nick Giordano, Professor Nicholas Giordano, is my guest. He's a professor of political science at Suffolk Community College, a native New Yorker. I love it. I'm also a native New Yorker, but I had a sojourn in Connecticut where I lost the accent, so I apologize. You're a professor of political science who has been talking about a lot of the stuff that I talk about on this program, which is to say the growth of government bureaucracy and the growth of government at the expense of freedom. So how did you get to that place? Were you raised in such a way that this was on your radar? Or did this come to you as you did your studies?
Well, I'm a student of history, and the Founding Fathers made it clear that we want a limited government, we want a small government, because governments continually grow, expand, abuse their power, and so we have to hold government accountable. And then what I saw with the Patriot Act beginning to unfold, that's what concerned me, because I was in Homeland Security.
When you say the Patriot Act, talk about what year was the Patriot Act?
It was shortly after 9/11. So normally it takes about 2 years to get pieces of legislation through. Most pieces of legislation never see the light of day, but the Patriot Act passed within 2 weeks. And it was an encompassing bill that really changed the dynamics of the national security framework of the United States. And people said, well, if you don't support it, then you must be doing something wrong. And too many conservatives went that route.
You're with the terrorists.
Correct.
Now, here's the problem. We recently had Naomi Wolf on the program. She and I were in the same class at Yale. She is politically liberal. She's a feminist. And so I became a conservative. And so when she wrote her book in 2008, talking about what a lot of liberals are talking about, which was the overreach of the Bush administration, I was stupidly in the camp of those who thought, well, it's George Bush. He's a good guy. I don't see him doing anything wrong. We've got to be firm against the terrorists. In other words, I was part of what I now see the problem. In other words, I was not sensitive at the time, and this is exactly what you're talking about, to how either Republicans or Democrats can be guilty of exactly the same thing. And when our guys do it, we say, well, it's okay. And it's never okay. But oftentimes, many of us get it wrong. And so you're quite right. The drumbeat against, terrorism, it was so vague, and it was thought such a crime to be against it. How could you be against it? And we gave up under George W. Bush's administration, which I now know was not such a great administration. We gave up a lot of our freedoms, which led to where we are today.
Well, there's a few things that I always look at long term. And I've been a conservative my whole life. And it's not necessarily that, okay, it's under the George W. Bush administration, what's he going to do with it? It's always, we don't know who's going to be in power the next administration.
That's the point. But what I'm saying is that I was stupid because I didn't think of that. At the moment, you kind of get sucked into it.
But that's natural.
Right.
Because most people tend to look at the here and now, and they don't look at that, okay, how could it be abused? How could it grow and expand? And remember, we were promised that the Patriot Act would never be used against Americans. We're not going to spy on Americans. And yet all we have to do is look at what's happened since then, where we had the NSA PRISM program that was literally monitoring every single American's electronic data. You had the Central Intelligence Agency spying on sitting members of the United States Senate Intelligence Committee in 2015. They were spying on members of the Intelligence Committee, and there was no real outrage to it. Nobody was held accountable. If you look at what the FBI did with former President Trump, launching an investigation, trying to take down a duly elected president, there were so many signs along the way. You had the IRS scandal with Lois Lerner in 2011, 2012, targeting conservative groups. So you had all these signs along the way that, hey, the bureaucracy has been weaponized politically to target political opponents. But not only has it been weaponized to target political opponents, you have these people, these unelected, nameless and faceless bureaucrats in senior leadership positions that think they're the guardians of democracy and that they get to decide what freedoms we get to enjoy and what we could say and where we could go and what we could do. And then you look at things like the coronavirus and how the power of government metastasized because people were afraid and they gave government more power. And it's a recurring theme, but this is all the things the Founding Fathers warned about, that it's easy to give government power when you're afraid, but the problem is when the crisis passes, that power is not restored to the people.
Thank you for listening to the P.A.S. Report Weekly Roundup Podcast.
Have a good one. Bye.
Be sure to rate, share, and subscribe to the podcast so you'll never miss an episode. Also, visit PASreport.com and follow us on Twitter @PAS Report.